Hello, and thanks for this invitation to talk to you about St. Ignatius Loyola and communications. I'm John Dardis. I'm a Jesuit working here in the General Curia in Rome, and my background is actually communications, and it's also refugee work. So I've combined a little bit communications and how it links to various apostolates around the Society of Jesus. In fact, a life-changing moment for me was when I worked on the border with Rwanda, just after the genocide there. I was helping to set up a radio station. It's just a short 3-month period of time, but it changed my life because I was in this very limited situation where people were really suffering and struggling, but also I could see how communications was so important and could give people hope. In fact, the radio station was called Radio Curia. Curia is the word for hope in the local language. So I'm happy to talk about St. Ignatius Loyola and communications and explore a bit what we can learn from him and how that tradition continues today. First of all, I was looking at the recent documents of the Society of Jesus about communications. And the most recent official document, it's not so recent, 1995, and it has a few lines that I thought were pretty interesting. It says that Ignatius identified the cultural shift of his time, which was the passage from the Middle Ages to the Renaissance. The printing press had been invented in the 1400s, so about 100 years later, Ignatius is seeing the potential and beginning to explore that potential for mission. And he oriented the society towards the future. He knew how to integrate gospel values and traditional cultural values with this new culture of communications, which, as we know today, is even more important and stronger than ever in our world and more complicated. So Ignatius, this was a key point for him, the key point. And the document from that congregation says, Jesuits today are called to understand the changes that are occurring at the end of this 20th century. That was when the document was written. And so even more important today that we get a grasp of the changes and the potential and the problems and the pitfalls and somehow discern God's voice in all of that, because that's what Ignatius would want. Giving you a bit of a roadmap here for the presentation, I'll talk a bit about how Ignatius always emphasized communication from a place of depth and truth. He saw the potential to get sidetracked. He saw the potential to fall into error. But so he emphasized communication from a place of depth and truth. And he also saw, number 2 there, he saw the importance of communication to bring about a union of minds and hearts. I'll say more about that in a while. We'll talk about imagination, the importance not just of words, but of imagination and images. And then I'll go through his letters, his autobiography, and I'll finish up on the society today and ask some questions about how we can be faithful to his tradition. So first of all, depth. Finding and communicating the way to God. It's one of our apostolic preferences, and it was the core mission of Ignatius, right from his own conversion, his own difficult conversion, his own struggles at Loyola. How do I discern the way to life, the way to God, from the way that's distracting and the way that leads me astray and that doesn't bring me to God? So depth. And as you know, Father Nicolas, the previous Superior General, he talked about the globalization of superficiality, the opposite of depth. And when superficiality becomes globalized through communications, it's even more difficult. And we're getting further and further from where we as a human race want to be. So depth, a few words on depth. The spiritual exercises. In the exercises, as you probably know, and the image there you see on the right is Ignatius writing the exercises in the cave at Manresa in eastern Spain. In the exercises, Ignatius emphasizes how God constantly communicates with us. Our God is a God of dialogue and communications. He wants to speak to us. He wants us to hear, to listen. He wants to hear our concerns. And this dialogue is redemptive. The Word becomes flesh. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. God is communicating God's self all the time, every day. I don't know what your concerns are now in your life, but God is speaking to you every day, every moment. We tune in through the Eucharist, through prayer, through lighting a candle in a church, to some small moment of silence. God constantly communicates with us. And again, in the exercises, Ignatius encourages us to talk to Jesus as one friend to another. It's very open communications. Ignatius also says it's vital to have a spiritual guide, and if we want to discern. It's so easy to go astray, to think I'm listening to God's voice, but am I really? In the exercises also, he encourages us towards the beginning of the exercises. He says, put a good interpretation on what the other person is saying. You can see that's so relevant for today as well. In this age of conspiracy theories, what are they saying? What's behind what they're saying? Can I trust it? He's saying, put a good interpretation on somebody else's speech. Don't start from mistrust and suspicion. It's a wonderful piece of advice. And then he also says, when we get into desolation, when our heads are going round in circles or our hearts are confused, well, share that with somebody. The danger is, I feel bad about myself. I feel this shouldn't be happening. I keep it hidden. And he says, no. Communicate that. Talk about what's happening in your deepest self, and you'll find a way forward towards the light. So communication from a place of depth. He always communicated from a place of depth. And when right from the beginning, he wanted to talk about his religious experience and listen to others. There are stories when he was in Manresa, he would help people, he would reach out to people, and became known for his wisdom. And he didn't hesitate to share his prayer. And so when he gathered companions at Alcalá and later in Paris, they engaged in spiritual conversation. I often wonder, as they walked through the roads of Europe, they had lots of time to talk. What did they talk about? Probably superficial things like the weather or how their feet were hurting, but also their history, their families, their friends, their struggles, their prayer, their questions. So we're invited to build the same kind of community today, following the example of Ignatius and the way he communicated. And then they discerned together, and sometimes in informal sessions, like when they deliberated about having a vow of obedience to one of their members, and so in effect forming a religious order. So they communicated, they shared, they prayed, they discerned together, and they were able to go forward. But Ignatius wasn't just about words. He knew the limitation of words also. And as you probably know, in the second week of the spiritual exercises, it moves from meditation to contemplation. He says, read the gospel text. For example, the Nativity. Look at Mary, look at Joseph, look at the baby. Feel the situation, smell, see, touch, imagine. Imagine yourself there. He knew the power of imagination. So again, what do we learn? We learn that communication is so much more than just words. It's also our imagination. The images can tell us so much about how to go forward, and our imagination can be redeemed and refocused and harnessed for good. In that sense, he's really following the way of Jesus. In the Gospels, we see that narrative is so important. Stories. Jesus told stories. When the lawyer asked him, "Who's my neighbor?" Jesus didn't go into a philosophical or theological theory. He told the story of the Good Samaritan. He said a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and got ambushed and beaten up. And so many people passed him by, but this Samaritan stopped and helped him. So he tells the story of the Good Samaritan, the prodigal son, the woman who loses the coin, the shepherd who loses the sheep and goes after the one lost sheep. Ignatius got that. Ignatius understood that. He understood that communications is so much about images and imagining and putting ourselves in the scene. So the lesson for all of us in this first part of my presentation is communication is about truth and about depth. So important, so important. Truth and depth. In an age of fake news and disinformation, which threatens our democracies, truth. And depth. In an age of superficiality, the call to depth. And then there's the call to trust. As I said, Ignatius encourages us to trust somebody, not everybody we meet, but to have a trusted advisor or friend with whom we can share without filters. Our credibility matters. It's so important also in communications. Who we are, the witness we give, so important. Ignatius and his companions, they witnessed by their deeds, by their outreach to the poor. This is what made their communication, their lives, so effective. Moving on to Ignatius's own story, his autobiography, he was initially reluctant to speak about who he was or his history. But finally, some of his close companions persuaded him, and he narrated his story to Gonsalves da Camara, a Jesuit companion, who then wrote down the text. And he did this because it wasn't a kind of an ego thing that he wanted to sell lots of books. He was persuaded that this really would help others. By telling his story, others would identify with it, could see themselves in that story, and could imagine themselves also following in the same kind of path, and could be encouraged. Yeah, don't lose heart. You too can follow Jesus. You too can find God in a personal and passionate way. Another element of his communications was the spiritual diary, a very complex document which recorded the inner movements of his soul. Not so easy to unpack that document. I'm not an expert on it, but an important legacy from him also. I move on now to the letters of St. Ignatius. He wrote literally thousands of letters, and they covered a whole range of subjects, written to a range of people in different situations. He wrote them on obedience, on maturing spiritually, on fraternal correction, on dealing with others, on perfection, on and on and on. If you go on the internet and just search for the letters of St. Ignatius, you can find all these different themes. So a wonderful diversity of letters which explain how he really wanted to help people in their diverse situations to find God and to listen for the Spirit. It was communication back and forth. Someone would write with a problem, he'd write with a proposed solution. But not dictating, usually quite respectful of the other person, respectful of the other person's situation, that the other person was in that situation, but he would give key elements that would guide that person in that situation. And he knew that communication wasn't always easy. St. Francis Xavier wrote to Rome in 1543. He's saying, I'm writing to you for the third time, but I just got one letter from you. It was way before email, so communication back and forth was not easy. And yet Ignatius knew this is important. You might be busy, you might be in a very difficult situation, but take the time to write, take the time to share, take the time to be in touch. Because he knew that communication built a union of hearts and minds. Jesuits weren't in a monastery together, they were in all sorts of different parts of the world. So how would they remain connected? How would they prevent a gradual fragmentation through communications? And in part 7 of the Constitutions, Ignatius stresses the importance of communications and staying in touch and taking the means to stay in touch. And this conviction of his, well, that started a tradition of letters back and forth, letters from the periphery, and then back out from Rome. And that tradition continues today. This wonderful tradition, so valuable, that has kept the Society of Jesus united even across the most difficult moments. They were letters that encouraged, that responded to situations, that consoled, that advised. And we know that so many companies today are really appreciating the importance of communications to keeping their businesses together and keeping their mission. One example, there's an amazing letter from Ignatius to the men going to the Council of Trent. As you know, the Council of Trent happened in the middle of the Reformation and all the conflicts that were provoked. And he sends some Jesuits there and he advises them how to communicate. He says, avoid conflict, don't provoke people, listen, don't rush to speak. Basically, a spirit of reconciliation, a spirit of friendship. And he's saying this in a Europe that was incredibly polarized. Now think of how useful that can be today. Another piece of advice he gave to those going to Trent was, he said, you should meet in the evening and each of you give feedback to the other on how you're doing and give advice. So for example, on a Tuesday, I might receive feedback from my companions about how I was doing and how I had been behaving and how my work could be made more effective. And then on a Wednesday, I would give you feedback on how you're doing. Very sensitive. You can imagine people getting hurt, and you can imagine it might provoke more problems than it solved. But Ignatius was so convinced that keeping this sense of union in relationships, clearing up misunderstandings, was absolutely vital if a Jesuit mission is to go forward. We need to think about this a lot today. Sometimes there can be hidden tensions in communities or in our ministries. And I think Ignatius would have a lot to say to us about how to go about resolving and healing and moving forward those inner tensions. The second example was the deliberation about the vow of obedience that the first companions had in 1539. Days of intense prayer, days of debate, days of diverse opinions, strongly held, strongly held. Prayer, more sharing, more discussion. And in the end, what they believed was a spirit-led consensus that yes, a vow of obedience was helpful for the mission and was in fact necessary if they were serious about going forward. So they arrive at this decision from an intense process of discussion together. I want to move on now to the issue of narrative. It's a short digression. Aristotle says that for effective communication, we need three elements. The first element is what he calls logos in Greek, so the message. The message. The second is ethos, so the credibility or the reputation of the person communicating. And the third is pathos, the connection we make at an emotional or gut level. And I'm convinced that Ignatius, I'm not sure if he knew those three elements that Aristotle spoke about, but he certainly practiced them and he put them into practice in the communications of the early society. So today's initiatives in the General Curia and in the Society of Jesus, what do I see that develops this tradition of Ignatius? What are we doing to build on this tradition? What are the growing edges? Well, as I said earlier, letters keep coming back and forth. If you live in the Curia like I do, you see letters coming in every day. They get stamped, they get filed, they get responded to. An incredibly good way for Father General to know what's going on in Europe, in Asia, in Africa, Latin America, all over the world. He can keep his finger on what's going on, keep a sense of the needs, and therefore give leadership. So these letters, some quite bureaucratic, some more, if you like, creative, these letters are a key part of the governance of the society, just as they were in the time of St. Ignatius. We've also got a few more new elements. Obviously, Ignatius didn't have email, so email allows us to get even more information. Sometimes it's almost too much. But we also now have begun using in the communications office, we have short video narratives, 1 minute, 2 minute, 3 minute. We had a series called One Gospel Step about the preferences. I'll show you an example in a moment. We use social media. Not to say, here's me in front of the Vatican, look at how great I am, but no, to link up with people and to promote conversion and to ask questions, to promote depth. Obviously, we've got a website. We do coaching with people how to take part in different public discourse. Here's an example of a narrative from an advertising firm. It's a kind of a Polish Amazon. And you can see in 2 or 3 minutes how effective this is. It tells a story. And at the end, we're left feeling something. We're left moved. And again, this is so key in Ignatian communications. Not to overpower people with facts, but in the end, we want people to be moved by the gospel. We want people to hear an invitation. And I sometimes think that secular culture and the marketing industry has got this much better than we have. But we're learning, and here's the little clip.
English for beginners. I am, you are, he, she, it is. I am, you are, he, she, it is. Robert, I am. Hi. Can you show me the way to the beach? Towel. Breakfast.
Fork. Knife. Bread.
I love you. You are perfect.
I'm gonna fucking kill you.
I'm gonna fucking kill you. I love you. You are perfect. I thank you. Suitcase, slippers, toothbrush, passport, pajamas. Be good dog. Hi, I am. Hi, I am.
Passengers on flight Aerolíneas Argentina.
Hi, I am your grandpa.
So you can see it's quite moving. The man at the end, he's been doing all this work. He's been trying to learn English so that he can communicate with his granddaughter. All this effort to communicate. Ignatius would be so happy. Same kind of effort that we need today as well. I'll show you another clip. It's a very short clip from here in Europe, from Hungary, of the Jesuit outreach to the Roma community, sometimes known as gypsies. We've called these little series One Gospel Step. The idea is that Jesuits and those who work with us are our mission partners, that we're trying to change the world just one gospel step at a time, with patience, with hope. We're trying to bring about little pieces of change. We're trying to bring little pieces of light into our world that so often is broken. So often. I'm thinking of the COVID emergency, so difficult for so many of us. As I speak, the war in Ukraine, the invasion of Ukraine, so many difficult things happening, so much violence, and the need to speak of hope and to be detectives of grace. Where is God today working? What's the Spirit of God trying to do? And if we can put our finger on that and say, we think God is here in this situation, in that person, in this initiative, in this small seed that we think will grow. That's what we need to communicate. The tradition of the incarnation was God becomes human not in a hugely grand way, in a big important place. God chooses Nazareth, a stable. God chooses Bethlehem, a small stable. Our God is a God who doesn't force himself on us. That's the God we're trying to communicate. And we can have a look at that small video now. Moving on to today, the normal issues, the daily bread issues, if you like, of communications. Saying thanks, praising people, communicating with benefactors. Ignatius did that. We're so dependent on our benefactors and so grateful to them. And as I said before, letters to Rome come in from provinces and regions and individual Jesuits and our mission partners. Some are maybe normal or regular, and then some are where we hear about serious situations like what's happening in Ukraine or Syria. And then there's the difficult issues like the cases of sexual abuse, the importance of communicating about those honestly and openly as best we can, communicating with those who've suffered, helping them towards healing if we can, apologizing when we have to and we need to, trying to bring about some kind of healing even though it's so difficult. So communication's so vital in all of that. So moving towards the finish, I think there's a call. I really do. If we want to follow in Ignatius's tradition, we need to think about our communications more strongly and more seriously. There are so many good initiatives going on. Do we communicate them? If Francis Xavier had not communicated what he was doing, the society would have been so different, so much the poorer. If he had just gone off to India and Japan, but never written back, we would have lost so much inspiration. And if Ignatius had not written his autobiography, or all those letters, that whole rich set of instructions, advice, his spiritual depth would have been, we would be so much poorer. We'd be so much poorer. So as I was preparing this talk, I was reflecting on that, especially on Francis Xavier. He didn't just go to India and Japan, he wrote back. And he didn't just wrote back, he wrote back with passion, speaking about himself and his heart and his soul and his prayer. We need to do that today. Communicate not just what we're doing in our schools, retreat centers, spiritual centers, but also why we do it. We need to communicate about how we see the grace of God at work in our world and through our work, with all humility. That's Ignatian communications. And I found this quote in the Constitutions. It says, "The more difficult it is for the members of this congregation," so the Jesuits, "to be united with their head and among themselves, since they are so spread out in diverse parts of the world among believers and unbelievers, the more should means be sought for that union." Even more important today. We're gathered in so many parts of the world. We work with mission partners all over the place. Places as diverse as the Philippines and Italy and Portugal and New York and South Sudan and Ukraine and Russia, Cambodia, Japan, China. So diverse, so spread out. How do we keep a sense of common mission, that we're in a common mission together, that we're passionate about that mission? We do it by communicating with each other, to each other, and about each other. In a sense, marveling and wondering at how God is working through us. Aware of the difficulties, the limitations, the pettiness sometimes, but marveling, gosh, God is working through me and through you. Some conclusions to finish up. You've been listening a long time. First of all, if we want a unified global body, communications is vital. Vital. It builds a common vision in a very, very, very fragmented world of disinformation. A common vision, the preferences. This has created a whole new energy. We need to share about them more, not just the theory, but where they're being lived. And then communications makes leadership possible for Father General. He hears, he receives messages, he understands, he discerns, he decides. It's a wonderful structure, a wonderful system. And then just to encourage you, communications always takes an effort. At the end of a long day, to write a letter demands creativity, to be interesting, to use imagination. Always takes an effort. So to encourage you in that effort. And then another conclusion is we need to speak from depth. Not just add to the noise, the Twitter, the Facebook, all those things. Yes, to be in Twitter, to be on Facebook, Instagram, but to speak from some experience of depth, relationship, prayer, sense of the Spirit. That's a wonderful vocation. Because the goal is to help souls and to reach out and to free people, to free people. It's all about liberation. Jesus says he was sent to bring good news to the poor and to set the oppressed free. We have so many people in our world today who are oppressed, marginalized, considered worthless. Our mission is to say, no, you're not worthless. You're of infinite value because God loves you. And we want to share that with the world so that people see that value and so that they get converted to that as well. So we move forward, following Ignatius, communicating like he did, and passing on the flame together. Hope that has been helpful. Thanks for listening. And I hope that you can pass on this flame and we can share together and gradually, humbly transform the world and build the kingdom of God. Thank you.